In a quiet part of the animal shelter, a sad cat named Charlie kept crying, because he missed his owner. His family, heartbroken, had left him there, not knowing how much he was suffering at night. One day Dr. White was checking Charlie and saw something strange on his collar. He looked closer to read the tag. Again, his eyes growing wide. "Oh my God," he said softly, quickly calling his assistant. Emma rushed in. "What's wrong, Dr. White?" she asked, looking from him to Charlie, still curled up in the corner. "Yeah, it's just, are you sure the woman who brought him said his last name was Carter?" Scott asked. Emma frowned. "Yeah, she said her name was Grace, and his was Francis." "Why?" Scott hesitated. "Because that's not on the tag." Charlie had been inconsolable since arriving at the shelter. Grace Carter, the widow of his late owner, had brought him in, saying he only ever listened to Francis. The family struggled to care for him and had no choice but to leave him. "If we can, we will come back to get him," Grace had said, dabbing away tears. Scott placed Charlie in a kennel, watching as the cat curled up against the wall, still crying softly. Though grief in animals wasn't uncommon, Charlie's sorrow was deeper than anything Scott had seen before. "I'm going to see Charlie," Scott told Emma later, still thinking about the strange feeling he had. He found Charlie in his kennel, covering his face with his paws. As Scott knelt down, he saw the collar still around Charlie's neck. "It's time to take that off," he said softly, reaching out, but Charlie suddenly screeched, jumping away and hissing. Scott froze, hands in the air, startled by the reaction. "Why won't you let me take off your collar?" he wondered. Aloud, he had caught a glimpse of the tag and felt a wave of confusion. "I must have seen it wrong," he told himself, but something felt off. Scott inched closer, voice soft. "Hey, Charlie, it's okay," he whispered, extending a hand carefully. Charlie's eyes narrowed, and with a swift hiss he swiped at Scott, claws barely missing. Realizing force wouldn't work, Scott backed away, frustrated but determined. Scott left the kennel, considering a new approach. Charlie wasn't just grieving, he was guarding something. A few minutes later, Scott returned with a treat and a toy. "Leighton, try this again, buddy," he said gently, placing the treat near the entrance. Before stepping back, Charlie hesitated, watching Scott, but eventually inched forward, sniffing. Before taking the treat, Scott remained still, a small smile forming. This was a step forward as Charlie chewed. Scott spoke gently, telling stories about his own pets. Little by little, Charlie relaxed, his body less tense. Scott tried again, this time with more determination. Charlie was still cautious, but their connection was getting stronger. Using another treat, Scott encouraged Charlie to lift his head just enough to reveal the tag. His heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered. The name engraved on the metal wasn't what he expected. It was a revelation that changed everything. "Emma, could you come here, please?" he called, urgency in his voice. She rushed in, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes darting between Scott and Charlie. Scott pointed at the collar. Whatever was written there was about to turn everything upside down. Scott was trying to put together a mystery that only seemed to grow more complicated. Every new piece of information raised more questions than answers. "Emma, do you know Grace's full name, and are we sure their last name was Carter?" His questions came quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Emma looked surprised, confusion written all over her face. "I'll have to check the paperwork." "Why, what's wrong?" she asked, sensing Scott's urgency. "That name isn't on the tag," Scott replied, his voice a mix of doubt and concern. Emma's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Not on the tag? Then who?" She paused, suddenly understanding what it could mean. "I'll check right now," she said, quickly, turning to leave. Scott refocused on the tag, trying to make out the name etched into the Worn metal, it was like trying to read. Something scratched into an old school desk, faint and nearly impossible to decipher. Charlie's constant shifting for treats wasn't helping either, making it even harder to get a clear view. Frustration was setting in. It felt as though the collar held the key to everything, yet it refused to reveal its secret. Emma returned holding a folder. Yes, there. Definitely Carter's. Grace Elizabeth Carter Mason and Francis Antonius Carter. Confirmed. Scott's mind reeled. If that was true, then why didn't the name on the tag match? It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Nothing made sense. He looked at Charlie, who was curled up protectively around his collar, as if it were his most prized possession. It was clear that taking it away would only distress him further. Scott sighed and decided to leave it alone, closing Charlie's cage carefully. But his mind wasn't ready to drop the matter. He needed answers. Back at his desk, he took out Charlie's records and began looking through them. Every past visit to the clinic, every little note, each detail was a clue, bringing him closer to the truth. One thing stood out. Charlie had been a patient for 6 years, but he was clearly older than that. He had to be at least 10. Where had he been before? Who had cared for him, and why was his name scratched out on the tag? The next logical step was to visit the Carters' address. Maybe they had the missing piece of the puzzle. Before heading out, Scott stopped to inform Emma and Yara, "I'm stepping out for a bit," he told them. "Call me if anything comes up." They nodded, used to his sudden investigative urges settling into his car. He punched Grace's address into the GPS. The caller's mystery nagged at him, refusing to leave his thoughts as the car hummed to life, his mind filled with theories. What if Charlie had been part of something bigger? What if the name on the collar had been erased for a reason? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. He pressed the accelerator, his curiosity pushing him forward. When he finally reached the Carter mansion, the enormous house towered before him, its silence almost unsettling. Scott parked the car and got out, his heart beating a little faster as he walked toward the heavy front door. He knocked firmly and waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman, someone clearly not Grace. "Hi, I'm here about Charlie." "Grace's cat. I really need to talk to her," Scott said, hoping she wouldn't find his request too strange. The woman gave him a curious look before responding. "Oh, Mom's not here right now," she said, then added, "But maybe I can help." Scott hesitated for a moment. He hadn't expected this, but decided to take the chance. "Would you mind if I looked at some old family photo albums? Maybe from around 6 years ago. I'm looking for something about Charlie." Jane blinked at the request, but didn't seem too bothered. "Sure, that's a bit unusual, but let's see what we can find," she said, stepping aside to let him in as Jane disappeared upstairs to find the album. Scott stood in the grand entryway, taking in the house's opulent details. Everything about this place spoke of history and wealth, but to Scott it also seemed to whisper secrets. His eyes drifted to an oil painting on the wall, a formal portrait of Francis Carter. There was something about the way he was painted, almost as if his eyes were following him. Then another photo drew Scott's attention. It was Grace and Francis smiling warmly with Charlie sitting between them. The cat looked utterly content in their embrace, and there around his neck was the very same collar. Scott leaned in, narrowing his eyes. The letters on the tag were clearer in the photograph than they had been in real life. He tried to make them out. His pulse quickened. The letters didn't match Grace or Francis. The realization sent a fresh wave of confusion through him. Who had Charlie really belonged to before he could process it fully. Jane's footsteps echoed down the stairs, breaking the silence. Jane clutched a book tightly, turning to Scott with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked. Scott hesitated, debating how much he should reveal. He considered making something up, but decided to be honest. "Instead, I'm really caught up in Charlie's story, especially after Francis passed," he admitted. Jane's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "My dad found Charlie after he was hit by a car. He was so scared it took a long time to calm him down," she said, her voice filled with nostalgia. Scott listened closely. "Why didn't Francis take him to a vet?" "Oh, he tried, but Charlie panicked. Every time he got near a car, he'd just run off and hide. It was easier to care for him at home." Jane then added, "He's been with us for 6 years now." Scott froze. 6 years? That didn't fit with what he had assumed about Charlie's past. As they flipped through the album, he noticed Charlie's collar in one of the older photos. Something about it stood out. "Has he always had this collar?" Scott asked. Jane frowned slightly, thinking back. "Yeah, he has." Scott's curiosity deepened. "Do you remember anyone who might have owned him before?" Jane shook her head. "No, we never knew where he came from before my dad found him." They continued turning pages until one particular photo caught Scott's attention. It was older and unlike Charlie's current tag, which was now scratched and worn. The name on this one was still perfectly legible. Scott's heart raced. This was a clue. "Can I borrow this? It might help me figure something out," he asked. Jane hesitated for a moment, then nodded, trusting Scott with the photo. Back at the clinic, Scott spread the picture on the counter in front of Emma and Yara. "Look at this, Emily Harrington." He pointed it out. A quick online search revealed a woman by that name living in a nearby town. The timeline fit perfectly. Scott's pulse quickened as he dialed her number. "I might have found your lost cat," he explained carefully, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely sure how she would react. Emily blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a long moment she simply listened, searching his voice for any sign that this was a misunderstanding or some kind of cruel joke. But his tone remained sincere. You think you found Charlie?" she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Scott nodded. "I believe so. Would you be willing to come to the clinic and see for yourself?" Still dazed, Emily managed a small nod. She couldn't find the right words, but she knew there was only one answer. Yes, of course. The drive to the clinic felt surreal. Her mind flashed back to the day she had lost him, the countless flyers she had put up, and the pain that had never truly faded. She had tried to move forward, tried to accept that he was gone. But now there was hope. When she arrived, Scott led her down the quiet hallway toward the kennels, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The scent of antiseptic and faint traces of animal fur filled the air, grounding her in the moment. Her pulse quickened as they stopped in front of a small enclosure. Scott gestured gently. "He's in there." Inside the kennel, a gray tabby sat curled in a tight ball, his green eyes way and untrusting. At first, Charlie yowled, a sharp defensive cry, the kind she had heard so many times before when he felt cornered or uncertain. Emily's breath caught in her throat. That sound, it was so familiar. Scott stepped aside, allowing her to move closer. Charlie froze mid-yow, his ears twitched forward, his pupils dilating. As he took in her face, Emily hesitated. She felt a lump forming in her throat, a mix of anticipation and fear. What if he didn't recognize her? What if too much time had passed? Slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand palm open, giving him the chance to come to her on his own terms. Charlie sniffed, his whiskers twitching along. Silent moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Then suddenly something shifted. His tail flicked, his posture changed, and a deep purr rumbled from his chest. Emily barely had a moment to react before Charlie leaned in, pressing his forehead against her palm and rubbing against her with clear affection. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as tears welled in her eyes. I lost him 6 years ago during a move, she choked out. I searched everywhere, but he was just gone. Scott watched quietly as she ran her fingers through Charlie's fur, her touch light but reverent, as though she were afraid this moment might vanish like a dream. The depth of their bond was undeniable, but just as the room settled into the warmth of reunion, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Yara, the clinic's assistant, appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. Scott, she murmured hesitantly. Grace Carter is here. Scott turned to face her. Grace, his brows furrowed. Yara nodded, glancing between him and Emily. She looks upset. Scott exhaled sharply and exchanged a glance with Emily before giving her a reassuring nod. I'll be right back. He stepped into the lobby where Grace Carter stood near the front desk, her hands clasped tightly, her face lined with age carried an expression of grief and uncertainty. For a moment there was silence. I heard you found a cat, Grace finally said, her voice steady but fragile. Scott nodded. Yes, we did. Grace swallowed hard. Is it? Charlie. Emily had followed quietly, standing just behind Scott as she stepped forward. Her gaze met Grace's, and something unspoken passed between them. The conversation that followed was difficult at first, both women holding on to their own pain, their own truths. Emily spoke of the heartbreak of losing Charlie, of the months and years spent searching for him, never fully able to accept that he was gone. Grace listened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. Then in a quiet voice she shared her side of the story, how she and her late husband had found Charlie wandering, how they had nursed him back to health, and how over time he had become part of their family. As they talked, the tension between them slowly eased. There was no blame, no anger, only love for the same cat. Their stories were together in a way neither had expected, forming a bridge of understanding. After a long pause, Grace exhaled softly. I suppose he's always had two families, hasn't he? Emily blinked at her. Then slowly she nodded. Yes, I think he has. And so after much thought they came to a decision, one that neither had anticipated but both felt was right. Charlie would have two homes, two families, and all the love he had ever known. Scott observed as they reached their agreement, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. Charlie's journey had come full circle. Sometimes love wasn't about choosing, sometimes it was about sharing. Did you enjoy this story? Do you also agree with the final decision to share? Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Sharing love for an animal is a wonderful thing. Do you agree? Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.